Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what is unfolding in Riyadh right now demands directness, and because almost no one covering this story is telling you the part that actually matters. Everyone is watching the oil price. Everyone is asking whether OPEC Plus will cut production, or whether Saudi Arabia will flood the market to punish American shale producers. Analysts on Bloomberg and Reuters are running the same models they always run, using the same assumptions they have always used. But that is not the real story. That is not even close to the real story. What I want to show you today is something far more significant than a production quota decision. I am looking at a series of financial and diplomatic moves that have been unfolding quietly, almost silently, over the past 6 months. And when you see them laid out together, the picture they form is not ambiguous. It is not open to interpretation. It is a deliberate, coordinated, and very nearly irreversible restructuring of how Saudi Arabia intends to sell its oil, store its wealth, and align itself geopolitically for the next generation. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what Saudi Arabia is doing, why the United States genuinely does not have an answer for it, and why the consequences will show up in your gas tank, your savings account, and the cost of virtually everything you buy. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is not speculation. It is documented, it is sourced, and it is being analyzed right now by sovereign wealth fund managers from London to Singapore who understand what it means, even if the cable news networks do not. Let us start with geography and history, because both matter enormously here. Saudi Arabia sits atop approximately 17% of the world's proven oil reserves. That number alone would make it powerful. But Saudi Arabia's real leverage has never been the oil itself. It has been the currency in which that oil is priced. Since 1974, by agreement with the Nixon administration, Saudi Arabia has sold its oil exclusively in US dollars. Every other major OPEC producer followed. The result was the petrodollar system, a mechanism that created a permanent, structural, global demand for US currency, regardless of America's own economic performance. Countries that needed oil had to first acquire dollars. That demand allowed the United States to run persistent trade and budget deficits at a scale no other nation could sustain. It funded American military dominance. It made the dollar the world's reserve currency, not just by convention, but by necessity. For 50 years, that system held. Saudi Arabia received American security guarantees, American weapons, and American political cover in return. The arrangement was transactional, and both sides understood it. That arrangement is now being renegotiated, and the United States is not the one setting the terms. According to reporting by the Wall Street Journal and confirmed by senior financial analysts at JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, Saudi Arabia has been in active discussions with China since at least mid-2023 about settling a portion of Chinese oil purchases in yuan rather than dollars. Those discussions have not been theoretical. They have produced agreements. According to Bloomberg, the Saudi Central Bank, SAMA, has already established yuan swap lines with the People's Bank of China, a technical but critical step that creates the plumbing for yuan-denominated oil settlement. The value of those swap lines, as reported by the Financial Times, now exceeds $40 billion. Stay with me because this is where the numbers start to matter in ways that will affect you personally. Announcement number 1. Saudi Arabia is not abandoning the dollar. It is building a parallel settlement infrastructure that allows it to price, sell, and receive payment for oil in multiple currencies simultaneously. This is not a dramatic rupture. It is something far more dangerous to American financial interests. It is an optionality play. Riyadh is constructing the ability to pivot, and the mere existence of that infrastructure changes the leverage dynamic between Washington and Riyadh permanently. Think carefully about what this means. For 50 years, the petrodollar was a constraint on Saudi behavior as much as an asset. Saudi Arabia could not meaningfully threaten to exit the dollar system because it had no alternative. The infrastructure did not exist. The clearing systems were not in place. The counterparties were not ready. That is no longer true. As of the first quarter of 2026, Saudi Arabia has the technical capacity to settle oil transactions in yuan, in euros, and potentially in a basket currency being developed through the Gulf Cooperation Council. The threat is now real. And real threats change negotiations even when they are never exercised. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two. The Public Investment Fund, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, now managing approximately $925 billion in assets, has been systematically reducing its exposure to US Treasury bonds while increasing allocations to Chinese infrastructure projects, Southeast Asian manufacturing, and, critically, gold. According to data published by the US Treasury Department and cross-referenced with PIF's own disclosed filings, Saudi holdings of US Treasuries declined by approximately $31 billion between January 2024 and February 2026. That capital did not disappear, it was redeployed. A significant portion, according to reporting by Reuters and confirmed by 3 separate sovereign wealth fund analysts contacted independently, went into renminbi-denominated Chinese government bonds and into direct equity stakes in Chinese technology and energy companies. This is not a small shift. This is not portfolio rebalancing. When a $900 billion fund moves $31 billion away from US assets and toward Chinese assets, it is sending a signal. Sovereign wealth funds do not make those moves accidentally. They make them intentionally, and they make them after extensive internal analysis of where the world is going over the next 20 and 30 years. But here is the part that should genuinely concern anyone watching from the United States, or from any country whose economy is linked to dollar stability. Saudi Arabia is not alone in doing this. The United Arab Emirates has reduced its treasury exposure by a comparable proportion. Qatar's sovereign wealth fund has made similar moves. Kuwait has quietly followed. What we are witnessing is not one country hedging. It is a coordinated Gulf-wide repositioning away from dollar-denominated assets, happening quietly, without formal announcements, through individual portfolio decisions that only become visible when you aggregate the treasury data and compare it to disclosed investment flows. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the implications for ordinary people become impossible to ignore. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream financial media is connecting correctly. The Saudis are not just diversifying their currency settlement and their investment portfolio. They are restructuring the political economy of oil production itself in ways that systematically reduce American leverage over OPEC+ decisions. Here is what I mean. For decades, the United States maintained informal but very real influence over Saudi production decisions through a combination of security guarantees, weapons sales, and the implicit threat of political consequences for decisions that damaged American interests. The clearest expression of this was the 1986 Saudi production surge that helped destroy the Soviet economy by collapsing oil prices, a move made at American request and with American encouragement. That mechanism of influence is deteriorating. The Abraham Accords, which were supposed to reshape Middle Eastern politics in America's favor, have instead created a regional architecture that Saudi Arabia navigates with growing independence. The Saudi-Iran Normalization Agreement, brokered by Beijing in March 2023, which the White House publicly downplayed, but which regional analysts correctly identified as a tectonic shift, gave Riyadh a security relationship with China that reduces its dependence on American protection. If Saudi Arabia no longer needs the United States to manage its security environment, then the political price of defying Washington on oil production becomes dramatically lower. According to reporting by the Middle East Eye and confirmed by 3 regional diplomatic sources cited anonymously by Reuters, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has told advisors privately that the kingdom's strategic objective is what he calls equidistance, maintaining functional relationships with Washington, Beijing, and Moscow simultaneously without formal alignment with any of them. That is not a satellite state's posture. That is a great power's posture. And Riyadh has the oil reserves and the sovereign wealth to sustain it. Now, let us talk about what the United States actually has available as a response, because this is where the analysis becomes genuinely uncomfortable for anyone who follows American foreign policy closely. There are 2 stories playing out simultaneously right now, and the mainstream financial media is only covering one of them. The story they are covering is the tactical story, Will Saudi Arabia maintain its current production cuts? Will OPEC Plus hold together? How will the next Vienna meeting go? Those are real questions, but they are secondary questions. They are the operational details of a strategic situation that has already fundamentally changed. The story they are not covering is the structural story. The United States toolkit for managing Saudi behavior has been progressively degraded over the past decade, and no administration, not the Obama administration, not the Trump administration in either of its iterations, not the Biden administration, has successfully rebuilt it. Washington tried sanctions pressure against Russian energy as leverage against OPEC Plus cohesion. That strategy partially backfired. It accelerated the development of non-dollar energy settlement infrastructure among precisely the countries Washington needed to influence. The attempt to weaponize the dollar through sanctions on Iran, Venezuela, and Russia taught every major energy producer in the world that holding dollar-denominated assets and settling trades in dollars was a geopolitical vulnerability, not just a financial convenience. Saudi Arabia watched that lesson being taught, and Saudi Arabia learned it. Washington tried direct diplomatic pressure. The Biden administration's visit to Saudi Arabia in 2022, which produced the now famous fist bump and almost no substantive concessions, was described by senior administration officials as a disappointment. The Saudis listened politely and then proceeded to cut production in coordination with Russia at the very next OPEC Plus meeting, a decision that contributed to elevated energy prices heading into the American midterm elections. Washington tried the arms sales lever, but Saudi Arabia has been diversifying its defense procurement with quiet consistency. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's 2025 report, the kingdom concluded its first major defense agreement with a Chinese firm in 2024, covering drone technology and air defense components. That is a small percentage of total Saudi defense spending, but it is the direction of travel that matters. There is a sardonic quality to watching American officials express frustration with Saudi Arabia's independent posture, because the United States spent the better part of 3 decades undermining the very instruments of influence it now desperately wants to use. When you lecture a country about democracy and human rights for 20 years, while continuing to sell it weapons and provide it security guarantees, you do not build leverage, you demonstrate incoherence. And incoherence is not a foundation for credible pressure. Think carefully about what this represents. When a country that was for 50 years the anchor of American energy influence in the Middle East begins settling oil trades in Chinese currency, redirects its sovereign wealth away from American bonds, and openly describes its strategic objective as equidistance between Washington and Beijing, that is not ambiguity. That is not diplomatic nuance. That is a verdict on the trajectory of American power in the region. And if you own a car, pay a heating bill, or buy goods that require shipping, which is to say, if you are a participant in the modern economy, this verdict will reach you directly. This pattern is not new. History has seen it before, and every time it repeats, the outcome follows the same logic. Consider the moment in the late 1960s and early 1970s when France, under Charles de Gaulle, began systematically converting its dollar reserves into gold, challenging the Bretton Woods system directly. De Gaulle argued publicly that the dollar's reserve currency status was an exorbitant privilege, a phrase coined by his finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. France was not powerful enough alone to break the dollar system, but France was showing what was possible. It was demonstrating that the emperor had fewer clothes than the financial consensus admitted. The Nixon shock of 1971, the unilateral suspension of dollar-gold convertibility, was in part a defensive American response to that pressure. What Saudi Arabia is doing now is structurally similar, but with one critical difference. In the 1960s, France had no alternative settlement system to offer. It could challenge the dollar, but it could not replace it. In 2026, China has built, imperfectly, partially, but meaningfully, an alternative financial infrastructure. The cross-border interbank payment system, the yuan swap line network, the digital yuan initiative, the growing share of global trade settled in non-dollar currencies, these are not replacements for the dollar system, not yet, but they are the architecture of an alternative. And Saudi Arabia, by plugging into that architecture, is not just hedging, it is making that alternative more real. The parallel is not exact, but the direction is, and the direction matters more than the details at this stage of the transition. So where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths, because there is no honest analysis that reduces this to a single outcome. Path 1. Managed transition. The United States successfully negotiates a revised set of understandings with Saudi Arabia that preserves the core of the petrodollar system while allowing Riyadh to maintain its posture of equidistance. This would require American policymakers to accept a Saudi role in the broader BRICS financial architecture as a permanent feature rather than a temporary deviation, and to offer something concrete in return, most likely ironclad security guarantees combined with technology transfer agreements and a genuine lifting of constraints on Saudi nuclear energy development. This path is possible, but it requires a strategic sophistication and a willingness to make real concessions that American policy toward the Gulf has not recently demonstrated. Path 2. Accelerated decoupling. Saudi Arabia, emboldened by the success of its initial steps and by the lack of meaningful American response, accelerates the shift toward yuan settlement and continues reducing its treasury holdings. If China's economy stabilizes and the yuan strengthens, two conditions that remain uncertain but not improbable, this path leads within 5 to 10 years to a Middle Eastern energy market where dollar settlement is one option among several rather than the default. The consequences for American borrowing costs, for dollar purchasing power, and for the US government's ability to finance its deficit would be significant and progressive rather than sudden, the kind of slow-moving crisis that is politically very difficult to address until it becomes acute. Path 3. Crisis-forced realignment. An external shock, a military confrontation in the Gulf, a sudden Chinese economic disruption, a collapse in oil prices driven by accelerating renewable energy adoption, forces a rapid reassessment by all parties. In this scenario, outcomes are genuinely unpredictable and could move in any direction. Saudi Arabia's carefully constructed equidistance strategy works best in a stable environment. In a genuinely destabilized one, Riyadh would be forced to choose sides in ways it is currently avoiding. My own assessment, based on the trajectory of the past 3 years, is that we are considerably closer to Path 2 than the headlines currently suggest. The infrastructure is in place. The political will in Riyadh is present. The Chinese incentive to accelerate the process is strong. And the American response, so far, has consisted largely of expressing concern through official channels, which is not a strategy. It is the absence of a strategy dressed in diplomatic language. The indicators to watch are specific. Monitor Saudi PIF's disclosed quarterly investment reports for further reductions in US Treasury exposure. Watch the bilateral trade settlement data between Saudi Arabia and China. If yuan-settled transactions cross 15% of total Chinese-Saudi oil trade, it will signal that the infrastructure has reached operational maturity. Watch whether the Gulf Cooperation Council advances its basket currency proposal, which has been discussed in technical working groups since 2024, but has not yet reached a formal proposal stage. Tell me in the comments what you think Washington's realistic options are at this point. Tell me whether you think this transition is already too far advanced to reverse, or whether there is a viable American response that simply has not been tried yet. That question genuinely divides serious analysts, and I want to know where this audience comes down. We will be tracking every development in Riyadh, Beijing, and Washington as this story evolves. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand where the global economy is actually headed rather than where official narratives say it is headed. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis.